extremely honored to be here and to present my work with you today. I'm going to present my book on Korean far-right politics. Given the current political climate, this topic couldn't be more relevant, unfortunately. But if we want to respond more effectively to the anti-democratic far-right forces, we need to better understand how they operate, how they think, organize, and mobilize. So I decided to write this book back in 2016 when there was large-scale far-right mobilization against candlelight protests. At the time, I kept coming back to a simple, puzzling question. In the midst of what people called democratic miracle, why were we seeing the rise of this far-right anti-democratic counter-mobilization, and why were some people resisting pro-democratic movements? So my book is the attempt to answer these questions. So over the past decade, we have seen the rise of far-right leaders and parties all over the world. And in many places, they have become more normalized and even mainstream. This political trend is very concerning because these forces threaten a liberal democratic system by promoting discriminatory and exclusionary agendas. More broadly, democracy itself appears to be under strain worldwide, with fewer people living under fully democratic system. South Korea, however, has long been seen as a model of democratic success. Since the end of military dictatorship in the late 1980s, it has developed into a stable democracy with strong civil society and peaceful transfers of power. The candlelight protests in 2016-17, which led to the impeachment of the corrupt, unlawful President Park Geun-hye, are often seen as a powerful example of democratic strength. But there is another side to this story. Right-wing counter-movements and authoritarian legacies have remained persistent. Alongside the candlelight protests were large-scale far-right mobilization that continued for years. In 2022, a conservative presidential candidate, Yoon was elected in part through anti-feminist appeals. And then in December 2024, then President Yoon declared martial law by accusing the opposition Democratic Party of pro-North Korea and anti-state and framing the situation as legislative dictatorship. And this martial law suspended political activities and curtailed press freedom. This was a shocking moment, the first such declaration in over 4 decades, and a stark reminder that democratic backsliding remains a real possibility. From martial law declaration in December 2024 to Yoon's impeachment in April 2025, South Korea showed a remarkable level of democratic resilience and solidarity. Ordinary citizens' strong commitment to democracy and their willingness to take to the streets ultimately led to his removal from office. But at the same time, we also saw something else. The majority of the ruling right-wing People Power Party supported Yoon and boycotted the impeachment process. More than 30% of the public opposed the impeachment, and a significant number of them actively supported Yoon and martial law. In central Seoul, as you can see, tens of thousands of people gathered, waving both South Korean and American flags as symbols of their so-called blood alliance with the United States. They framed their protest as an effort to save the Republic of Korea and its liberal democracy from what they called the threat of the radical left. You could see signs and hear chants like "Stop the Steal," "Nullify the impeachment," and "Support Yoon." Many of these protesters were deeply influenced by conspiracy theories, some of which Yoon himself endorsed. The claim that elections had been manipulated by North Korea and the Chinese Communist Party. In the snap presidential election in May 2025, the liberal candidate Lee Jae-myung ultimately won. But if you look at the numbers closely, the two right-wing candidates, Kim Moon-soo from the People Power Party and anti-feminist candidate Lee Jun-seok together received about 49% of the vote, nearly equal to Lee's total. So my book is about South Korean far-right and its organizational and popular foundations. Throughout the book, I try to answer the following questions. First, what and who is the far-right in a Korean context? And why do ordinary citizens fervently support authoritarian leaders and vehemently resist the pro-democratic changes and social demands? What fuels far-right mobilization? And how have right-wing politics shaped the South Korean political trajectory in the post-authoritarian period from 1987 to the present? So how can we locate the South Korean case in existing literature? Existing scholarship on this topic explains the rise of the far-right in Europe or in the US in the recent decade as a reactionary response to political insecurity and economic inequality in the context of globalization. So those whose economic conditions deteriorated have discontent with mainstream politics, whether it's left or right. And in the meanwhile, right-wing populists harness economic discontent and anxiety by accusing immigrants and refugees from stealing jobs away from the native population. While this explanation makes a lot of sense in Western countries, it has limited capacity in explaining non-Western countries where immigration issues are not that prominent. Most studies also focus on far-right parties and their electoral performances or grassroots far-right movements. So in my study, I try to address these gaps by paying attention to the historical and geopolitical legacies and the broad coalition of diverse groups and organizations on the right. So broadly speaking, I have two big arguments in my book. So First, it is essential to look at the historical legacies of the Cold War, national division, and the Korean War, and authoritarianism in shaping the far right in South Korea. So some people might think that the rise of the far right, whether we are talking about extreme right-wing YouTubers, evangelical groups, or certain politicians, is a relatively recent phenomenon that emerged after the impeachment of Park Geun-hye in 2016 or 17. But here I want to suggest that the roots of the far-right politics in South Korea go much deeper. And also, because of the confrontation with North Korea, South Korea's ideological landscape has long been skewed to the right. So for a long time, only anti-communist and right-wing positions could be safely expressed in mainstream party politics, and even moderate conservatives were often accused of being communists or commies. The democratic transition in 1987 was also partly the result of concessions made by ruling authoritarian regime. As a result, elements of the military authoritarian force remained within the ruling party even after democratization and were never fully dismantled. So today's right-wing People Power Party traces its roots back to the authoritarian ruling party, and it includes a wide range of actors from militant extreme right-wing groups to more moderate conservatives. This makes it quite difficult to draw distinction and boundary between the far right and mainstream conservatism in the Korean context. So what is often labeled conservative in South Korea can in many cases be closer to what would be considered far right in other countries. And within the right-wing party, there is often very limited space for genuinely moderate conservatives. Also, I conceptualize a right-wing infrastructure in my work, which refers to the sets of organizations, institutions, and groups essential to enable, maintain, and enhance the rightist political goals and environment. So while these different entities are distinctive, independent, separate from one another, they often exchange information, collaborate together to promote the common goal. So by emphasizing this broad, by capturing this broad landscape in the right, I try to overcome the dichotomy between institutional party politics and extra-institutional social movements. Before I get into a closer analysis of the far right, I want to clarify a few terms right now because they can mean different things depending on the different context. So while the left-right distinction used in Western countries is not irrelevant in South Korea, so whether they promote equality, egalitarianism, and actively intervene in the market, the country's specific historical and political conditions shape what those terms actually mean. So the terms themselves also can be contested as well. So in everyday usage, people tend to use conservative and progressive instead of right and left. But regardless of the labels, one of the biggest differences is their stance toward North Korea. So the left or progressive emphasizes dialogue and negotiation with North Korea and promotion of peace in the Korean Peninsula, whereas the right or conservatives tend to take a more hostile, hawkish position toward North Korea. And because of the long-standing dominance of conservative forces in South Korea, the presence and influence of the left have been relatively limited, especially in mainstream party politics. Although there are genuinely left-wing parties, and technically Korea has multi-party system, political power is largely concentrated in the two major parties, as you can see. As a result, what many people refer to as a left in party politics is actually the Democratic Party, which is better understood as centrist or center-right. But to denote the Democratic Party, I use the word liberal or reformist or reform-oriented because there are real left-wing parties in Korea. So as you can see, they have distinctive positions toward peace and North Korea, and obviously economic positions are also distinctive, but these are like catch-all parties, so they include like broad range of different positions. What does the far right mean in Korean context? So although this term is also complicated, scholars often argue that far right in general is further right on the broader right spectrum. So for example, sociologist Cynthia Miller-Idris defines the far right as those who represent more or less extreme segments of the anti-democratic and illiberal, exclusionary, hierarchical, and dehumanizing ideas that prioritize and seek to preserve the superiority and dominance of some groups over others. Here, group categories can be varied among different contexts. Obviously, in the Western context, others can mean immigrants, refugees, or Muslim, ethnic minorities. But in the Korean context, the others are different. And in the South Korean context, a range of actors can be associated with the far right. So in my book, I include the People Power Party and its predecessors, and some parts of state apparatus, for example, prosecution and military and national intelligence agency, along with right-wing media, civic organizations, and highly committed far-right supporters. So what do they claim? On the surface, these groups often claim to support liberal democracy, but this term can be very confusing in Korea because when we mean liberal democracy in the US or other countries, it denotes political system that guarantees civil rights, political pluralism, rule of law, etc. But in Korea, liberal democracy is often reduced to a set of positions like anti-communism, hostility toward North Korea, strong pro-Americanism and increasingly anti-China sentiment. And another strong feature of far-right is the veneration and idolization of former authoritarian leaders like Seungman Rhee and Park Chung-hee, respectively framed as the founding father of the Republic of Korea and the architect of national modernization. And more recently, some have even begun to openly express support for Chun Doo-hwan, the military dictator responsible for the mass killings in Gwangju in 1980. So even though they invoke the term liberal democracy, there is clear tension. Many seem to believe that democratic principles can be totally sacrificed in the name of eliminating perceived enemies like communists or socialists. This raises an important question. When people openly support authoritarian leaders and justify violent state actions, can we really describe them as democratic or even simply conservative? So my study draws on 18 months of field research in South Korea, combining in-depth interviews and ethnographic observations conducted across various sites. I also collected archival data as well as chat room postings available in the Korean Messenger KakaoTalk. These rich qualitative materials provide an insider perspective, allowing me to analyze why and how far-right actors and their supporters believe what they do. Okay, now let me turn to the narratives shared by the far-right over the past few decades. So what we see here is a striking continuity between earlier and more recent discourses. So for example, Yang Dong-an, a journalist and far-right intellectual, argued that the extreme left had captured the culture and media sphere. As you can see, he said today the leftists in this country dominate universities and social science reading circles. And similar claims were made by other far-right elites, such as Kim Gi-chun. So again, he said that these leftist forces try to overthrow the system, current socio-economic order. And also Chung Hyung-gun, he said that publishing sector, cultural spheres are completely dominated by this radical left and Kim Il-sung followers. So you see the commonality between different people in their narratives. They framed South Korea as being under threat from a subversive left that had taken control of key sectors of society and was attempting to overturn the socio-economic order. And it is important to note that Kim Gi-chun and Chung Hyung-gun represent prototypical far-right elites. So both of them graduated from Seoul National University Law School, began their careers as prosecutors, worked in national intelligence agencies, and later became career politicians within the right-wing parties. Kim Gi-chun, a former attorney general, was also involved in drafting the Yushin Constitution in 1972 under Park Chung-hee regime and was later appointed by Park Chung-hee's daughter Park Geun-hye as a chief presidential secretary. During the Park Geun-hye administration, he helped compile a blacklist of critical intellectuals and artists. And Chung Hyung-gun, meanwhile, served as a deputy director of the Agency of National Security Planning, Angibu, and served as a 3-term member of the National Assembly. And what is particularly notable is that these similar narratives are not just confined to the elite circles. In recent years, I have found that they continue to circulate widely among ordinary writing citizens in both online and offline. In this worldview, Korean society is seen as dominated by the extreme left, including 3 major organizations like Korean Confederation of Trade Union, Media Workers Union, and Teachers Union. although union power is pretty weak in South Korea, but they promote this type of narrative. And for them, young people are often portrayed as having been ideologically influenced and brainwashed, while their demonstrations are interpreted as being linked to North Korea. And they also argue that student movements in the 1980s actually was a communist movement. This was very common narrative. And then in KakaoTalk, I often encountered claim that right now in South Korea, there are 200,000 North Korean spies. And more recently, claims about electoral fraud, allegedly involving North Korea and China, have also become part of their narratives. So this type of narrative strongly resonates with elderly population, one of the core constituency of the far right in South Korea. So as a generation directly shaped by the Korean War, many were raised with strong anti-communist education and deep hostility toward North Korea. At the same time, their experience of rapid economic growth in the 60s and 70s reinforced a belief in the importance of strong leadership, particularly under Park Chung-hee. Many feel that they built the Republic of Korea through their blood and sweat. As a result, when they hear the claims that the radical left is trying to overthrow the state, they often respond with intense anger and anxiety. Now, let me turn to how the far right has evolved over time, especially last 20 years. There were several key moments when it made concerted efforts to build organizational infrastructure and mobilizing civil society. So the first moment came in the early 2000s, a period conservatives often refer to as the lost decade. For the first time in modern Korean history, the conservatives or the right lost presidential elections. And the victories of Kim Dae-jung and Roh Moo-hyun came as a major shock. At the same time, former student activists from the 1980s entered Liberal Party and became a significant mainstream political force. While many on the right felt deeply threatened, this period also created a new opportunity for them to rethink their strategies. In particular, they began to learn from their political opponents, especially the importance of grassroots mobilization and the efforts to build cultural hegemony. So in this context, we can understand the rise of the so-called New Right in early 2000. This was one of the first movements to combine intellectual work with grassroots organizing. It established organizations aimed at disseminating right-wing ideas more broadly in society. The movement challenged what is saw as left-leaning interpretation of history and instead promoted more positive assessments of modern Korean history, especially promoting the great achievements of Seungman Lee and Park Chung-hee. At the same time, it was highly critical of the pro-democracy movements of the 1980s and delegitimized it. So the 태극기 protests in 2016 and the Yoon Again movement in 2025 were not sudden developments. They did not emerge overnight, of course. Rather, these large-scale mobilizations were made possible by the extensive organizational infrastructure that the far right had built over a long time period. To understand this, we need to pay attention to this particular strategy of Metapolitics. So this term is appropriated by the Western far right. So basically, this term means the effort to shape public opinion by targeting cultural sphere and promoting far right worldviews. Interestingly, this idea of metapolitics in Western countries and also Korean far right actively drew on the idea of Antonio Gramsci, the Italian revolutionary. So basically, they emphasize the idea of building cultural hegemony and waging a war of position. So how ironic. So they established publishing houses dedicated to publishing, right-wing books, as you can see in the photo, and obviously built some grassroots organization to promote collaboration among different right-wing groups and activists. And they actively expanded their presence in online and social media sphere, especially in YouTube channels. So a lot of YouTube political channels are dominated by the far-right influencers, and there are many. So this is one of the examples, 신의 한수, Masterstroke. And this is one of the most popular political YouTube channel, and it has more than 1.5 million subscribers. So I also want to highlight the close connections between the People Power Party and the far-right movement. So today, some far-right YouTubers have become part of the People Power Party, and the party actively recruits these online influencers to the party. At the same time, party members often participate in street protests where they give speeches and reinforce shared narratives. Okay, now I want to introduce some recent developments of the far right. First, we see an increasing appropriation of leftist discourse among the far right actors and groups. So for instance, they have adopted the language of civil disobedience. So Yoon, the former chief editor-in-chief of the 조선일보, Joseon Daily, even compared the Yoon Again movement to those led by Mahatma Gandhi, Nelson Mandela, or Martin Luther King. And this kind of framing helps them legitimize their movement and enhance their mobilization capacity. And second, anti-feminism has emerged as a key ideological resource recently. As anti-communism has lost some of its appeal among younger generation that did not directly experience the war, anti-feminist rhetoric has resonated strongly, especially with young men. So by emphasizing male grievances and complaints, some right-wing politicians like Lee Jun-seok in the middle have gained substantial support from the young men. So I want to show this graph of the voting result of the Senate presidential election in 2025. As you can see, young men in their 20s and 30s overwhelmingly supported two right-wing candidates. So the middle is Kim Moon-soo for People Power Party, and the third column is Lee Jun-seok, anti-feminist candidate. So 75% of young men in their 20s voted for them, and then 60% men in their 30s voted for the two. If you look at female votes, obviously the trend is the opposite. Finally, the far right is becoming increasingly transnational. So in South Korea, it often draws on the tactics and discourses of the MAGA movement in the United States. You can see the two red cap here. And Korean-American networks play an important bridging role, for example, through groups like CPAC, KCPAC, so Korean Conservative Political Action Conference, facilitating connections, strategy sharing, and collaboration around the shared goal of countering the so-called radical left. And I want to also note that Charlie Kirk visited this evangelical rallies of the youth group right before he was assassinated. And also there are there is a billionaire in Hawaii who actually funded this KCPAC. So basically, two headquarters in the United States are located in Washington, D.C. and Hawaii. So this transnational connection is very vital at this point. So to conclude, I want to say historical context matters. Like the historical and geopolitical legacies of national division and Korean War and authoritarianism significantly shaped the Korean far right. And there is importance of far right intellectuals and their particular strategy, like Gramscian strategy, appropriate, like targeting cultural sphere and building cultural hegemony to promote their goal. And there is deep connections and alliance between the party and social movement sectors. And to sum up, I want to say, the metaphor of old wine in a new bottle is perfect to describe the Korean far right, because their narratives are still very old, but they have adopted a lot of new technology to promote their goal. So this is it, and thank you for listening.